Ha, gotcha.
You have got me. You have got me.
So, welcome to our podcast. I'm really excited to welcome Dr. Sean McDowell from Biola University. We've had him in Calgary several times to speak, and he's a popular lecturer and speaker and a popular atheist speaker as well sometimes. Hey, Sean.
Hey, good to be with you. You introduced me as a doctor, but I got a t-shirt on. You got like this nice sport jacket. So, I guess I'm ready to roll.
Yeah, well, it's all good. Doctors don't always have to wear sports jackets for sure. But listen, I'm really glad to be able to chat about your new book and the Stalemate with Tim Muehlhoff. We had him at our conference as well just a few years ago here. Except it was during COVID, so we didn't really get a chance to do a lot with him. It's too bad because I really appreciate what you were writing in the book. And as someone who's writing a conversations book on LGBTQ2, I thought this was a great sort of idea to sort of glean what you've learned, and then to maybe also bring up practical ways we can use that book, because your book is very practical for our audience as well. So tell us more about why the title and the stalemate. What's that about?
Well, I'm glad you had Tim up there. He's the one who invited me to write the book. He is a communication scholar, did his PhD at practicing dialogue across worldviews with, let's just say, a non-Christian doctoral team at UNC.
Very cool.
He's like, it feels like you're trying to do this in my ministry, on my channel, in different areas. Let's write this together. I was like, awesome. So we really wrote the book before we had the title. That came out of it. I probably spent more time coming up with a title and book cover for this for any book I've ever done.
Okay.
We thought about calling it End the Standoff, which is a little bit more of a military metaphor.
Yeah.
I think it's just meant to capture that whether it's politically, religiously, culturally, we're just at a stalemate. We're not talking to one another anymore. In fact, Tim found a stat from the 2016 election in my country. I think it's a third of people ended a relationship with somebody else because of a political or worldview difference. Something's going on. We're at a cultural stalemate.
Mm-hmm.
And yet I also think there's a hunger for people to just talk and listen and engage. Not all people. There's a lot of people that don't care and want to preach and just throw hate on all sides. But I think there's a lot of people that want to know how to have meaningful, productive conversations and relationships. That's who we're writing for.
Yeah, and you talked about two views of communication that I think are important for us to break down a little bit here, the transmission view and the ritual view. Maybe can you chat about that and how that would apply in our everyday conversations?
So the transmission view is basically the typical way we think about communication, that I write a tweet, I write a book, I communicate with information to you. Me as the sender have information, and I find some medium to transmit it to you. Now, there's value in that. The Bible's full of that. That's what prophets did. That's what preachers do. In fact, that's what the Word of God is it's transmitting information from God through prophets, written word to us. So we're not saying the transmission view ends. In some ways, this podcast is a transmission view. So I believe in that. The ritual view is a way of entering into relationship and conversation with somebody else, where you step into their worldview. You try to see the world as they do and really feel the world as they do. It's more of a horizontal kind of mutual type of conversation that transforms the way we communicate with other people. So we're just saying, let's keep transmitting truth, but let's find ways to enter ritualistically into relationship and conversation with people. And in fact, one of the things that sold me on writing this book with Tim is he calls it an incarnational model of communication. I thought, what an interesting phrase, because we have a God who steps into human race and quite literally sees the world as we do with human weaknesses, feels the world as we do, was tempted in every way, yet without sin. What if we communicate with others in a similar fashion? I think it could transform the way we communicate people. And frankly, I think it's a great way of loving people.
Yeah, no, it really harkens back to the verse that we talked about in my former ministry, that we are ambassadors for Christ. So ambassadors, by definition, have to go to a place where they have a different culture or different language or mindsets. Otherwise, how can you be an ambassador? It just it doesn't fit the profile that God has given us when He says we are in the world, but not of it. So maybe give an example of how we can use both in a conversation. Say on the LGBT questions, what are some ways we can use a ritualistic view of our excuse me, of our conversation rather than just transmitting information?
So let me broadly make a distinction. Maybe the way what comes to mind is what I do on, say, my YouTube channel.
Mhm.
A lot of times I bring people on. I brought on, I had a lady on who describes herself as the OG lesbian content creator on YouTube and has a way bigger channel than I have. And I thought, this is not a debate. I'm not trying to argue her into anything. I want to understand how she sees the world, why she sees the world that she does, her backstory, her experience. And part of that is I'm just curious. That's interesting to me. I think that's a way of showing that we Christians are not threatened by people who see the world differently. And frankly, I don't want to have a straw man view of how and why somebody else sees the world as they do. So I just asked her questions about how she came out to her family who was Catholic. That's interesting. Asked her some political views just to understand, not to debate politics, just understand her story. That's a kind of ritual communication. I had another friend I brought on who's an atheist lawyer, and I was trying to do the ritual communication, but it came very clear to me within about 5 minutes. He wasn't interested in that. He's a lawyer and we have a relationship. He really wanted to debate. I was like, okay, let's debate. So we debated God and morality and shift more to the transmission view, you might say. There's value in both. I just had a debate recently with Michael Shermer. I invited him on not to hear his backstory, but for 2 hours to debate God and morality.
Right.
But I also bring a lot of people on and just get behind the scenes and ask them questions related to the people who have influenced them, the life experiences who have shaped them, and especially the people who have deconstructed. I
Right.
want to get behind the curtain, so to speak, and understand why they rejected the Christian faith and what's going on. Oftentimes, then you can really minister to somebody when you understand what the root cause or causes might be.
Yeah, no, and that's such an important thing. One of the things for our new ministry, because our ministry is called Redeeming Conversation, so really focus
Mhm.
on conversation training as well, is that it's not that we give up on facts and truth, it's that we have to connect facts and truth to the emotional, to the character, to the goodness of the gospel. Because I think that's one of the biggest challenges we have here, especially in Canada. It's not whether the gospel is factual, we have to make that case too, but whether the gospel is actually still good news. And when you have a country like ours where the elites are very anti-Christian, I sometimes wish we had the same kind of political or cultural stalemate you guys have here. We've lost all of that, and we have a situation where you simply being Christian may get you dismissed. From running for political office or losing an opportunity for work. I know it's similar in California, but this is a national thing for us. And even with the new conservative government, if it's elected, Christian values are not going to be promoted because they're afraid of losing that space. Could you just comment maybe on the idea that we actually have to prove both the truthfulness of the gospel and its goodness to a culture that's so morally relativistic?
This is a really important question because what we're not doing in the book is a political program or a 30,000 foot view culture shifting agenda, for lack of a better term.
Right.
We're trying to equip people to talk with their neighbors, with
Mhm.
their coworkers, with their family members, with their friends, over coffee and online. There is need and room for both. So I thank God for people who advance the Christian case by making films showing that the natural family or the Christian story of redemption is beautiful. I thank God for politicians in Canada, in the US, who are advancing religious liberty, not just for Christians, but for everybody. So we are not taking away from or undermining those unique political challenges that are at play. Want to support those. This is a bottom-up thing that all of us can do. All of us as ambassadors for Christ can have better conversations with people about things that matter. So I look at like Tactics, like that's one of the best apologetics books in the past quarter century.
Mm.
That's a transmission kind of debating, engaging mode. And all Christians need to get better at that. But some Christians find that difficult. Everybody can ask questions and listen.
Mm.
Everybody can build common ground. Everybody can be appropriately empathetic in their relationships and engage their neighbors. Now, in part, what this does is when people hear the narrative, well, Christians are bigoted and hateful and intolerant. And their next thought is, but I know a Christian personally.
Mhm.
They don't treat me that way. It starts to challenge that narrative.
Mhm.
So, do we want to change culture and affect politics? Of course, but that's downstream from just saying Christians, let's love our neighbors better. One way to do this is to really understand and engage into their worldviews and to meet them where they're at and love them. Sometimes I think about it this way, Jojo. I think if somebody's life was just broken and wrecked, and their next thought was, I just need to find a Christian because
Mhm.
a Christian will listen and understand and care for me. I doubt that's true in Canada because I doubt that's true in the United States as a whole.
Right.
That's in part what we're arguing Christians to do. Now, last thing I'll say related to your question, I think you're right. We have to show that Christianity is not only true, but it's good and it's beautiful. The problem is within Christianity are built in certain ideas about the nature of happiness, human flourishing, the nature of sexuality that are considered within themselves harmful and hurtful. And many Christians feel like I need to soften that and water that down and make it appear good to people. And I say, time out. That's not an option for a Bible believing Christian who actually cares about the objective flourishing of culture.
Mm. Yeah, no, one of the key things, it's a bit of a pet peeve of mine, Sean, is the idea that we always try to balance truth and love. And what we would like to point out is actually it is love, but it's the proper definition of love. It's not saying I have to tell you that I love you, but I have to tell you the truth. It's actually saying it's because I love you, I need to tell you the truth. And that really changes our mindset when we approach these conversations, when we realize, no, love requires me to be difficult sometimes on facts and on things we have to say, but how we say that, and that's something that in your book particularly I really appreciate. It's also part of the messaging. When I look at something like a piece of advice, a practical piece of advice, like you talk about not creating a straw man for the people you talk about, and instead creating a steel man. I really thought that was a good conversation, practical conversation piece. Can you tell us more a little bit about that?
Yeah, this is an example where I'm preaching to myself because this is something I want to continue to get better at. I'm reading a book right now that's affirming. I'm coaching myself, going. The book is making the case that the Bible's affirming. I'm coaching myself, going, okay, what arguments are they making? What's the strongest version of this argument? Am I really responding to it in a way I would want somebody to respond to me? And as I look back, I haven't always done that. It's sometimes easier to set up a straw man and knock it down. And most people aren't going to go do their homework and actually look and see if you've done that. Most people just won't take the time to do so. But I don't appreciate it when people do that to my arguments. I mean, over and over again, doesn't matter if they're Christian or not. When people go, McDowell's saying this and reject it, I'm like, okay, you haven't even read my source. That's not fair. That's not right. You're misrepresenting my views. Well, if I don't like that, then let's not do that to other people. And frankly, when we steel man other arguments, sometimes we start to realize, oh, maybe I was wrong on this and I need to change my views, which I've certainly done. So I think it's just a way of having integrity and a way of honoring other people and their arguments and a way of showing confidence in the truth and a willingness to follow it wherever it leads.
Yeah, and I think too, it allows us to truly understand the other perspective in the best light possible, and that empowers our arguments, empowers us to be able to say, is what not just what I'm saying is true, but is it, am I connecting to the person so they understand that the position we have is actually what's good, like I said, because often what I find, I don't know if you found this, is that most people have good goals. It's how they get to that goal That's the problem. So, do we want to help the poor? Absolutely. But do we really need the kind of government system that allows for that? Do we believe in the right to choose for women? Yes. But does giving the right to kill a child, their unborn child, the most empowering thing for women? So, the goal may be the right goal, but it's how we get there that's the problem.
I think that's right. So you could take issues like gun control. I don't know anybody who's like, hey, I'm on the side of school shootings. Like,
Right. Yeah,
I'm
yeah,
sure there's somebody out there with the manifesto. Everybody wants to reduce it, but they differ over whether getting rid of guns or certain kinds of guns versus arming the population is a better way to get there. Even on immigration, there's differences over how many people should immigrate, but for the most part, most sides want a kind of justice
mhm,
and a kind of mercy, but they cash it out differently
right.
as a whole.
Mhm,
So I, I agree with you. And I think that when we understand it that way, it at least I think makes us a little bit more charitable
mhm,
towards people who hold other views and less likely to demonize them. And I can say things like in conversation, I said, you know what? I totally affirm this goal of what you're trying to accomplish
mhm,
and actually share that with you. I think we have common ground here and want the same kind of results. But
yeah.
where we differ over, like you said, Jojo, is how we get there. And
Mhm,
that kind of building common ground, I think, is charitable towards others. It lowers the temperature a little bit and enables a more productive conversation. I mean, I can't, it's like one of my friends who's an atheist, he said this to me. He's like, even on his side, he said so many people misrepresent a conservative view on abortion and say conservatives just want to control women's bodies. I want to hear that. I'm like insulted by that because that's just so false and fails to understand what pro-lifers believe.
right.
He was upset about that. My atheist friend was like,
Right.
that's not right. They shouldn't misrepresent. And I was like, good for you.
Yeah.
So I think approaching it the way you're describing at least helps us be more charitable towards people and understanding why they believe it, not questioning motives,
Right.
but arguing on the facts.
Yeah, I really what I do when I do training like this, and I think the same principles are in your book too, is that when in conversation, you need to be able to find or help create a person of peace, like Jesus says to the disciples. And one key way to do that is even to begin the conversation by saying, "Can we disagree and still be friends?"
Hmm.
That question has been very helpful because it gives you, and especially here in Canada, Sean, and I love your comment on that. There is such animosity against Christians. We're one of the most distrusted and hated groups when they do surveys, like journalists, used car salesmen, evangelicals are they're down there, right? But that question helps really focus the conversation. So if the person says yes, we can disagree and still be friends, they're a person of peace, and you can actually have that back and forth, just like with your atheist friend, and know that they understand that there's a difference between what the person believes and what the person is, and that those are two different things. But if the person says no, we can't disagree and be friends, then they have a problem because now they have to define friendship. And show and explain how many friends they have that agree with them 100% of the time on everything, right? Because that's the issue is they're putting a standard on us particularly that they don't put on anyone else. And I think being winsome in conversation means addressing that as one of the often the first goal or first step is this person even intellectually honest, or do they have all of this baggage that they put on us because we believe differently than them?
Hmm. So I think that's a really interesting question to start a conversation with. Now, oftentimes someone's not going to come on my channel or even meet me for coffee if they already kind of know what I believe. So
Right.
I think most people are going to say yes once you get to that point.
Mhm.
There's quite a few people who won't even talk to me because of my position. In fact, my co-author was canceled from speaking to an atheist group specifically because of he wrote a book with me
Right.
and my view on pronouns. He was canceled because of that.
Right.
Well, there's some people that don't want to have that conversation, are going to cancel us, and that can be on the left, that can be on the right, that can be Christian, that can be atheist. But for the most part, framing a conversation that way, I think helps just say, hey, when it's all said and done, friendship is important here. In fact, if somebody says no and they're willing to at least talk before they, hang up on me, I'd say, hey, would you mind telling me what you think a friend is?
Hmm. Hmm.
What differences do you allow in your life? And where do you not want differences? Would you recommend Christians do the same thing? I mean, you want us to change our views. Would
Hmm.
you recommend we cancel everybody out of our lives who also follow that advice? I'm really interested in that kind of conversation and seeing where it goes.
Hmm.
What's all said and done, I think most people, in the right way and in the right time, if we have the right attitude, do want to be in relationships with people who see the world differently and are willing to have those conversations. That's my experience.
Yeah, you actually said that in your book that most people do want to have those conversations, and that's great. I'm not sure I would say the same thing about Canadians because we're so
Mm,
afraid about
mm.
offending people. There's actually laws now that we have to deal with. I guess in terms of applying your book in our situation, when there is so much fear, especially in the church, Sean, what would you give as advice for us in that kind of environment?
I wonder in Canada, and you obviously know better than I do, if people would want to have that, but they're just not doing it because of the fear.
Mhm.
I suspect underneath the surface, they still would want that,
Mhm.
but I could be totally wrong about that. You know your context better than I do. So in the Old Testament, the most commonly repeated refrain from God to human beings is do not fear,
Mhm.
do not be afraid. Number one, that comes from Dennis Prager and his commentary I have right here on Genesis. He's
Right.
Jewish. I've been reading this. And in part, why? And
Mhm.
I tweeted this out this week. I said, why is this the most commonly cited, command in the Bible to not fear?
Mhm.
I think the answer is cross-culturally and cross-time is our default position is to be afraid of our reputations, be
Right.
afraid of our livelihood, be afraid of our lives.
Mhm.
That's a human default position. And this is what cancel culture does. Is cancel culture essentially is like if someone holds the wrong view or has wrong position, typically through social media, we will just pile on that person to wreck their livelihood, reputation, platform, whatever it may be, and cancel them. Well, one response among Christians is to be like, you're going to cancel me. We got a big tribe. We're going to cancel you and play the same game.
Right.
And I'm not saying there's not a time to
Mhm.
cancel. That's not my point. But a knee-jerk cancel you kind of response seems to be one option.
Mhm.
The other option is to live in fear and not say anything because we're afraid of what other people do to us. And I just last night, my wife and I watched this new movie on Bonhoeffer. And I don't know how much of it is historical or not. I have not studied his life, but his willingness to speak up against the church
Mhm.
in Germany at that time that was being favorable towards Hitler, his willingness to risk his life. I mean, I just laid in bed so convicted and asked myself, man, how many times am I afraid to
Mhm.
speak what I really think is true for whatever reason? That's why the Bible says, do not be afraid, do not fear.
Yeah, I really I've been teaching this to the youth groups that I speak to that God is more interested in our character than our safety as Christians. And
Hmm.
when you process that, that speaks a lot to things like the problem of evil or even the suffering or pain that we have, but ultimately to our purpose here on earth. It's not pain avoidance. And I think one of the things that I was reading your book too, in terms of people's lack of empathy or lack of willingness to engage conversation. The one thing that struck me is that the scriptures very much tell us, and I think you mentioned that in one of your tweets, recent tweets, is to love our neighbor as we love ourselves. And I think when we fail to engage in conversation, it's because we don't actually know what it means to love our neighbor as well as to love the Lord. To really prioritize the fact that no, we have to engage in these difficult conversations on pronouns or find out what our neighbor thinks, our Muslim neighbor thinks about this or that, because we don't really care for them in the long run. We're so focused on the things that will protect us. And it really harkens back to what Jeremiah said to the people of Jerusalem who were conquered by Babylon to say, no, your job is to pray for the peace of your city. and to
Mm.
realize you prosper when they prosper, and you're going to be stuck here for 70 years. So for most people, that was their lifetime. There's no escape, and we're stuck in our own Babylon. And I think that that speaks to the fact that we have to start asking ourselves, what does it mean to love our neighbor in Babylon?
That is exactly the right question. I like the way you phrase that with students. Did you say faithfulness is more important or obedience is more
Our
important than
our
safety?
our character is more,
Character.
yeah, more
Character
important
is
than
more
our safety.
important
Yeah.
than safety.
Mhm.
And what that says is there's so much concern and emphasis on safety today. And of course, we want to be safe. In fact, I have a theology that was just sent to me on a theology of safety. I was like, just the fact that somebody's writing on this is just indicative of where we're at as a culture for so many different reasons.
Yeah.
And so I like that. I mean, just read the Bible and the Gospels. What happened to them for following Jesus? And
Yeah.
that apple cart of safety that Christians have had has been turned over. And I
That's
think some of the bleeding of people who call themselves Christians and the growth of the nuns is people who just bought a cultural Christianity. And we're weeding some of that out, going, okay, what does it really mean to
right.
follow Jesus in what some have increasingly called an anti-Christian culture? And there's something to be said for that.
Yeah.
It just might cost us something.
Yeah.
That's that's one way we have to frame it, I think.
Yeah, I love Bonhoeffer. I'm glad you mentioned him because that's part of his whole theology is like it's having an eternal perspective. So just going back to conversation, Tranisha, I think even the conversations on safety, I realize when you discuss these issues with people, it's actually about feeling safe, not being safe, that they're emphasizing. And that's extremely part of our culture. It's all about feelings. It's all about making sure that people have or have this sense of well-being when really what God cares about is our well-being. And those are two different things. So let's tie that back in because we spent a lot of time on pronouns, and that's one of a lot of questions we deal with. A lot of times people would argue that we have to use proper pronouns for the sake of well-being for the person we're talking to, but that's not what you said in your book. There's more to it than that, you said.
Yeah, as you know, because you helped me with the dialogue I had a number of years ago, I've shifted a little bit on this issue.
Mhm.
And that's just from thinking about it, praying about it, thinking about what's at stake. Is probably initially I didn't have any issue or concern with using pronouns and would just say it's a way of being hospitable and respectable and respectful and keeping the conversation going. It's just a word. Christians can agree to disagree, whatever. I increasingly view it differently. I think language has power.
Mhm.
There's a difference between a name, whether it's Sean or Jojo or Jessica, which are culturally determined,
Mhm.
and pronouns, which carve up the world at its joints, so to speak, about whether we're male or female, referring to the creation as God has made it. And I increasingly just will not affirm something that's false. Now, I'll do everything that I can to be kind towards somebody, to listen to them, to show empathy, to meet them where they're at. But one concern is just being coerced with a power play into using a kind of language. There's that legal concern. But second, it's affirming something false about creation.
Mhm.
And language has power. It has power, how it divides up the world. And I can't think of any other medical condition where we say it's loving to misrepresent truth to somebody. I've asked around, I can't think of any. So why do we make an exception here? I suspect because more is going on than just what you described as flourishing. So my co-author and I differ over that. We didn't know going into this book, but we added a last chapter where we would just kind of disagree. And then we had an hour-long conversation back and forth on YouTube on pronouns. We're trying to model, like he's a brother in Christ. He teaches at Biola. He has an evangelistic heart, wrote a apologetics book with J.P. Moreland, worked with Crew for years. And yet we see this differently.
Mhm.
How do we stay in relationship amidst this difference? So we tried to model that in the book and in that conversation rather than just cancel each other.
Yeah, no, I really like that. I really like the fact that there are two Christians having this conversation, and a part of the challenge is how critically important is this in terms of our theology. So
Yeah.
just wrapping up, because this is one of the key questions we face, Sean. Let me throw you what I don't know if I've ever shared what we do here, because
Okay.
I'm sympathetic to your point of view. I'm in agreement. We don't codify laws or you don't force people to do that. But the problem is we live in a culture that is trying to do that. And I meet regularly with a transgender man. I don't know if I've ever shared this story with you. And he actually came up after a talk I gave on transgenderism at a church and said, I disagree with everything you just said. And I said, great, let's have coffee and talk about it. And he said, yes. And
Good
so
response.
we've been meeting regularly since. He grew up in a Christian home, very fundamentalist. I know the family, very good Christian family, very much. And I think he says, he has medical conditions and stuff, but he uses obviously female pronouns. And as we met over the years, he's become more and more feminine looking. So it's jarring to meet him the first time and then see this. And so
Sure.
about our fifth or sixth meeting, I actually said to him, I don't want to use these pronouns because I don't think that's true. I think you're a man, but I'm willing to use these pronouns with you in conversation, in our private conversations, as a sign of respect for you, but not as a sign of agreement. Would that be okay? And he said, "Oh, that's really kind of you. That's great. I'm glad you're respecting me." And I thought this is a way for me, at least for that conversation, to navigate because he knows every time I use those pronouns, like you said, I'm not enforcing false ideas. But at the same time, he knows every time I use the pronouns, I'm not agreeing with him and that this gives me an opportunity to continue the conversation. I don't think we should just do that for the sake of conversation, but I think in certain situations where we're forced to, like maybe we find out at work, I've heard this story where someone has a boss and they find out 2 weeks later after their new boss comes in that the person's actually trans and they've been using the wrong pronouns the whole time. What do you do? And the principle that I abide by, and I love your comment as we wrap up here, is earn the right to have a conversation on pronouns. So you're intentional in choosing steps so that it's not just about sharing the gospel, it's so that you can have that one-on-one conversation with them about what the proper way to navigate this without compromise on both sides. Maybe if you could just comment on that, and we'll wrap up after that.
Yeah, so even if we differ on some of the particulars that you laid out here, and this is a longer conversation that we could have,
Sure.
I deeply appreciate the thoughtfulness and the way you've nuanced this, trying to keep the relationship going and yet being faithful to Scripture. I'm not sure most people take the time wherever they land on this to really think it through that intentionally. That's in part what Tim and I are trying to get people to do, even if we differ in the end and agree that a lot is at stake. I would say just a couple things. The sphere in which we use pronouns has a lot to do with it in a business,
Mhm.
in a classroom, with a neighbor, publicly versus private, with an adult, with a child, with a Christian, with a non-Christian. These are all spheres that get lost when we just say I would or would not use a preferred pronoun. So in your case, I mean, I don't know a lot of details there. I would probably personally navigate it a little bit differently, but this is not public, right? And you've made it clear, here's what I'm doing and here's why, so he understands. That gives me a lot of sympathy for where you're coming from and why you do it. So yeah, I mean, I could talk about other ways I would navigate a conversation like this. Maybe you've done this. I would want to say to somebody, I would say something to the effect of, hey, help me understand where you're at.
Mhm.
Why using pronouns matters so much. I want to hear the backstory.
Mhm.
And then say, would you be open to hearing how I see things and why I'm hesitant to do so and just understand it?
Mhm.
And then when you're at the point where you said what you said, you can say, so I just want to make sure if I'm willing to do this, you understand the cost for me to do so.
That's good.
That's one way that I would nuance that conversation if you go that direction. Although I would probably navigate it a little bit differently. Your thoughtfulness and the way you're going about it, I think, is in itself helpful to people trying to navigate these incredibly painful and difficult circumstances that is just not always black and white.
Yeah, I actually also told him, and I forgot to say this, that I will refer to him as a man when I'm talking about him outside my conversations with him. So he knows the purpose of my using those pronouns is simply for those opportunities to have a conversation with him, not as something that I use to affirm. But I think that's part of the ongoing way we as Christians engage in conversation, which is the whole purpose of your book.
Hey, let
So
me ask you this. Can I cut in just
sure.
totally rudely? You
Yeah.
said you'll refer to your transgender male friend as a man,
When I'm talking about him with other people. And
not a transgender man, because some Christians take issue with even saying transgender man. I don't have a problem because it brings clarity,
yeah.
but you would refer to a biological female as a man without the qualifier when talking about him, just so I understand.
Right, right. No, he's biological male. So I'm referring to him
Oh,
as a man, but he's gone through the transition
okay.
to female. So yeah, I'm sorry. The language is important. You're right.
Keep
Yeah.
going. My bad. That's what makes these things so difficult.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. So no, he knows I refer to him as a man because that's what I know he is, and
Got it.
he understands the only purpose I have for using pronouns is in his conversation, my conversations with him. That's the only reason why I do it. And every time I speak about him in public or in books that I write or whatever, it's always as a man. So no, for sure. I think part of it is, like you said, learning to navigate through these things and being able to be thoughtful about it and giving that advice. So my advice for most people is always be truthful and be honest and understand that that's what they often need to hear. I also give a caveat to say that parents have an exemption to that rule. Like I think you have a right to insist because you have a special, unique relationship with this individual that no one else has, that friends don't have. So there's lots of those nuances, and I would really love to have further conversations if that's okay with that. Sean, especially when my book comes out, I'm hoping to bring that out next year. But I would love to have you say anything else. If there's anything more critical you think that people should know about the book, where can they find the book? How can they get it in their hands?
I'll just say I'm glad you're writing the book that you're writing. My book is kind of 30,000 foot view. It's not issue focused. You're taking the principles, not that you're taking them from my book, but similar principles and applying them to this issue in a way people can really practically apply. And knowing you and just your commitment to scripture and the gracious way you want to engage people, I think it's going to be fantastic. So keep working on it. I don't know that I have a ton more to say in the statement. I would just say again, I think most people are open and willing to have meaningful conversations. I got an email yesterday from somebody who's using it in their small group and just said how many people have reported to her just healing relationships with family, whether it's with progressive Christians who've left, LGBTQ people across the political divide, and said we've been able to build bridges using some of the principles here. That's why we wrote it. So if you find yourself just at a stalemate, so to speak, and trying to figure out how to communicate with people who see the world differently, there's no formula to force people to do this. Jesus let the rich young ruler walk away. In
Mhm.
Acts 17, some people mocked Paul, but you know what? There's a lot of people who are open to it. And I think it's a way of loving people if we lean in that way.
Yeah, I'm actually really glad that you mentioned the rich young ruler because one of the key ideas in your book that I think is critical for us to understand is that success doesn't mean you convince the other person to change their mind,
Amen.
right? Success means you enter the conversation where God has brought you to bring that truth, to share that love, and that's what I take from the book. That's a really good thing to share. So
And honestly, I'm so sorry. Here's the way I define
yeah,
success.
sure.
It's lovingly speaking the truth,
Yeah.
filled with the Holy Spirit,
Mhm.
and leaving the results to God.
Right.
That is a success.
Great. Well, Sean, Dr. Sean McDowell, with the great shirt, the funniest doctor with the greatest shirts that I've seen. I really appreciate your time, taking your time. I know you need to get going, but really appreciate your time. Maybe we can continue the conversation later on, and really just encourage people to enter those conversations as our job as ambassadors are to do.
Thanks, Jojo.
Okay.